Hundreds of dispatch riders would arrive here every day with intercepted German Morse code messages that needed decoding. It was vital that the Allied commanders could find the key that would crack the Germans' code to find out where U-boats were gathering or what Rommel's panzer divisions were up to. To crack those codes, enormous numbers of calculations were needed at high speed, and to do them took the invention of some extraordinary computers at a top-secret location. That place was here, Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, known as Britain's best-kept secret. So, in today's Open Saturday, we'll be looking at how those codes were cracked. Modern code breaking on the internet. And deciphering the natural code of life, the human gene. And the secrets of digital error correction, how a CD can still play even when it's got a major scratch. One of the stars of this morning is this rather wonderful piece of kit. It's called Colossus, rather aptly. It's a copy of the earliest hardwired electronic valve computer, and it's been lovingly reconstructed here at Bletchley Park by the Colossus Rebuild project. But for all of their glory, what is so special about computers? Aren't they just faster calculators or very swift slide rules? Well, let's start with a look at how calculations used to be done. This is part of a programme from the Open University's Maths Entry Suite. For many years, people relied in looking up the answers in tables.
The reason tables were important at the time was that England was a leading maritime nation, and ships relied on determining their position at sea from astronomical navigation, that is, determining their position from the position of the stars. They had to take readings to do that and had to use tables to perform mathematical calculations to determine their longitude. The problem was that increasingly people found there were errors in tables. A random selection, supposedly, in the 1830s and 40s of 40 volumes of printed tables revealed 3,700 known errors. The problem, of course, was not the known errors, those you could compensate for and get correct values. The problem was the insecurity of the unknown errors.
Removing these errors became the lifelong task of the 19th century English polymath, Charles Babbage.
The story really starts with John Herschel, Babbage's lifelong friend, the famous astronomer. He and Babbage were sitting at the Astronomical Society in 1821 checking tables. These are tables calculated by hand, and they were quite appalled at the discrepancies between the two sets of tables, the expected value and the calculated value. And Babbage, as it were, clasps his hand to his brow and says, "I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam." One of the very difficult things to do with mechanical devices is to get them to perform direct multiplication and division. The advantage of eliminating multiplication and divisions in the mechanism was something that Babbage perceived, and that is the basic principle of his engines.
When x is 0, the polynomial has a value of 41. As it operates, the engine uses the method of differences to compute successive values. This polynomial needs a greater number of simple additions to give the result for each value of x. Why might Babbage have designed his engine to give values which were much too accurate for everyday use?
It's a fabulous piece of engineering, isn't it? Well, this morning we're here at Bletchley Park looking into the secrets of computing, and I've now been joined by Tony Sale, who runs the Computer Museum for the Bletchley Park Trust. Tony, first of all, what was the first computer you ever had?
Well, it was this machine here, which was an Elliott 803, built in 1962, and in late 62 I had one of these all to myself for 9 months as my personal computer, a bit bigger than the modern PC. And if we take an example of the Elliott 803, then the memory in that is actually stored on one of these rather fantastic looking planes of bits here. And these, each bit of the memory of the information is stored in a little ferrite core, and there are 4,000 of them in this bit plane here. But compare that with this, which is a modern SIMS chip, and there we have 4 megabits in one of those chips there. So that's how memory has changed enormously over the time since this computer was built. But also, storage systems have transformed as well. For instance, this rather complicated system here is a 35mm film handler, and the film is coated with magnetic material. And that is where the data is written onto magnetic material on there.
So that takes the place of the floppy disk, effectively?
Yes, indeed it does. And one of these big reels here holds 7.5 megabytes of data in modern money. And of course, a floppy disk can be accessed in a fairly short space of time, whereas this took 15 minutes to find a block of data there. But it was very reliable, and it was a very nice system which stored data very effectively at those times.
I had no idea they used film. And then what happened? We were stretching in front of us here is the whole history almost.
Yes, that's right. We've got an IBM computer from the early 70s, a transistorized computer. And then we've got an example of the punch card. You had to put data in and out of a computer. And one of the ways of doing that was punch card or paper tape. And now, of course, we come to a modern Pentium PC. And, of course, that's all singing, dancing. But it's still difficult for the average user to find out how to use the machine. And this is where the technology, I think, has failed us, in that we've got better gizmos, faster gizmos, but we haven't solved the problem of making computers really do something useful for the average person.
So there's still a long way to go, you think?
I think there's a long way to go, and it's got to come in the evolution of software, psychology, and all that sort of stuff has got to come into it. And computer scientists have got to learn that technology rather than just concentrating on making things go faster and smaller.
And increasing memory. Well, thank you very much for that, Tony. And as Tony was saying, back in the 1950s, in fact, computers had very little memory whatsoever. And to give you an idea of just how crude things were back then, take a look at this piece of film from 1951.
Like all good amateur movies, this one tells a story. The EDSAC had begun to work in May 1949, and we had developed a system of programming based on the use of a library of subroutines. The film was made for the first joint computer conference held in Philadelphia in December 1951, and it was, I think, the first film showing the operation of a stored program computer to be made.
EDSAC wasn't constrained by how it was wired. It had a memory where it could store temporarily a sequence of machine instructions.
The EDSAC made use of a serial ultrasonic store consisting of 32 tanks. It was possible to exhibit the contents of the memory on a cathode ray tube, like this. There are 16 lines. The presence of a 1 is indicated by a bright dot, and the presence of a 0 is indicated by the absence of a dot. You will see a program tape being read, and the instructions filling up one of the tanks from the bottom. I hope that this old film will give you some idea of what computing was like in 1951.
Yes, that was nearly 50 years ago and things were very different. But now let's go back even further to the Second World War and the birth of modern computing, because what was invented then was an entirely different kind of machine altogether.
According to a classical definition of a machine, it is something, a device that somehow channels the forces of nature through a mechanism into a very specific purpose. A computer does not fit that definition. A computer's purpose is only specified when you load a piece of software into it and execute that software. Now, that shift in the fundamental nature of machinery was not really understood by the inventors of the computer.
So software was at the heart of understanding these new general-purpose machines. But it's often been ignored by the historians.
The history of computing until now has been dominated by the milestone machines like the ENIAC or the IBM 360 or the Apple II or something. Now, software is also a cumulative process. Today's software developers build on the work of their predecessors, and there's quite a bit of that. You don't start with a completely blank sheet of paper every time. But how do you talk about a milestone like that? It slips through your fingers when you try to grab it.
Engineers were building a digital computer because they could see that was the coming activity, and they wanted to learn something about digital computers, so they just built one. And one day my boss came over to me and said, "Gene, do you want to be the programmer for this computer?" I said, "What's a programmer?" He, being a very nice guy and a very competent engineer, said, "I don't know what a programmer is, but I know we need one. How would you like to be it?"
So what are the milestones in the history of software? Who were the first programmers? How has their job changed? And will we need them in the future? The birth of modern computing is said, mostly by the British, to have started with Colossus. It operated at the top-secret Bletchley Park in Buckingham and was designed to crack the enemy codes of World War II. The war was also an impetus to the development of ENIAC, considered, mostly by the Americans, to be the first computer. ENIAC was initially designed to calculate the firing trajectories of field guns. How would the angle of the gun, shell size and wind direction affect where the shell would fall? Kay Morkley was one of the first people to work with the machine.
The ENIAC itself was 80 feet long, and because it had 18,000 vacuum tubes that generated a lot of heat, so the biggest noise that you could hear in the room, however, were blowers that were in the ceiling that were supposed to carry off the heat from the vacuum tubes as they heated up. The machine was not turned off at night. It was kept going night and day because a lot of the tube failure would occur if tubes were turned off and then turned on again.
ENIAC was more like a mechano set where you put pieces together to make a machine of your problem. So you put all these pieces together. You're more like an architect. And you would pick up the trays for the numbers to go across and the digit trays at the bottom. Each one weighed 42 pounds a piece. So I was never in any better shape in my life when I picked those things up. But programming for the ENIAC was not like programming today at all. It's more like building a machine.
Colossus and ENIAC are said to be computers because they were general-purpose machines. Their purpose was changed by changing their wiring.
The machine was not wired specifically for a problem. You actually had to do the wiring for each problem. However, say once you had set it up to run trajectories, you could run 10 million of them. If you had a brand new problem, which had nothing to do with trajectories, then you would just pull out all the connections that you already had and then start off with making new connections, and you'd also reset all the switches.
we know that the ENIAC was very far away from the kinds of things we call a computer today in terms of its logical structure, but it pointed the way toward that. It did have a kind of general purpose ability. You could rewire it. You couldn't program it, but you could rewire it very tediously to do lots of different things.
The generality of ENIAC was demonstrated on a secret research project.
I can't remember when we first became aware of the fact that we weren't with a machine that was just going to do trajectories. When the people came from Los Alamos with the very, very first problem, we thought, oh, well, we're just testing it. This is what they told us. This was a test for the ENIAC.
I was on the machine, and at night they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. I'll never forget that night. I never went to bed, because when I got home, the newspaper said what this thing was, and I realized, I put two and two together, that I had been working on the Manhattan Project and people from Los Alamos. And I'll tell you, I couldn't sleep after that.
Here was a problem that was so immense that it took every switch on the machine. So we thought, well, this is a tremendous test, but once that's finished, we'll go back to doing trajectories. Actually, it never happened that way. Once people found out about the machine, various professors from different parts of the University of Pennsylvania had problems which they had been storing up, and if I ever have a machine, I will do this, and they brought them in and tried to run them.
Despite being new general-purpose machines, they had one important failure.
The ENIAC and the Colossus had a lot of limitations, and I think that that's worth keeping in mind. One of the biggest limitations for the ENIAC, which is the machine I know the most about, is that it really had to be literally rewired for every new problem. The only thing that made it a little easier is that instead of having to cut the wires and solder them again, you had plug boards, kind of like an old telephone switchboard. You could draw out diagrams of the wiring for a new problem and then bring it to the machine, but while people were doing the plugging, the machine was of no use.
You're watching Open Saturday from the Open University. This morning we're looking at the history of computing and code breaking. If you'd like to know more about this subject, and indeed what else we'll be covering in future programmes, here's how.
You can call the Open Saturday hotline on 01604 673 817 or write to us at the Open University, PO Box 625, Milton Keynes, MK1 1TY. There's an Open Saturday email address and a website. And we're also on CFAX, page 617.
Very interesting. Now, today we are at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, and until the 1970s, this place was top secret. And what went on here during the Second World War actually helped to spur the development of computers. In the early 1940s, radio operators all over Britain and here at Bletchley Park were listening in to German armed forces, Morse code messages between, say, U-boat commanders and their high command. And actually that is real Morse code that people are sending to each other right at this moment. Now the Germans weren't too worried about the enemy listening in because they coded their messages using one of these, an Enigma machine. A U-boat commander would type a message into his machine, perhaps giving his precise location in the Atlantic, and out would come a coded version, which his radio operator would send back to base as Morse code. And there, the message would be decoded using another one of these. Now, Enigma machines were quite common. There were thousands made, and in fact the people here at Bletchley Park had several of them. But the Germans still weren't worried, because the Enigma machine is useless unless you know the starting position of these rotors. And that crucial key, just a short series of letters, was changed every day. So the problem for the dozens of top-level mathematicians who worked here day and night was to work out the starting sequence of these rotors, and from there, crack the code. And all they had to work on was the message itself, nothing more. And every extra hour it took to decipher a message could cost another merchant ship on its way from America to Britain. So, Tony, how on earth did they manage to crack the codes?
With great difficulty and a lot of mental effort. It really was an enormous task facing them. And what they had to do was to find the wheel settings that the operator had used for each message, and these wheel settings were changed every day. It was about 10 million times less chance of finding those by chance than by winning the lottery. So it was an amazing feat to do, and the amazing thing is that they found these settings generally within 3 hours, by 3 o'clock in the morning of the following day. But the way they were helped with this was because the Germans made mistakes. If the machine was used properly, it is infallible, but they made silly mistakes, and they used key settings like diagonally across the keyboard, like that. And there was one particular gentleman in Germany who was Bletchley Park's great friend, and he always set his wheel start positions to WAL, and he used a message start of KLA. And he did this every time, every week, consistently. And they finally worked out that this was Walter, and his girlfriend's name was Clara. And that is how ciphers are broken even today, by people making silly mistakes.
So the machine is infallible, but human beings are very fallible.
It is, that's what it is, yeah.
Well, Tony, let's just see how infallible you are, because I got a message this morning, and I'd like you to work out what this says. It's gobbledygook to me. Let's see if you can crack that code.
Right, well, it's obviously it's come from the bomb room, and the bomb room, of course, is where the Turing bomb have been churning away, finding the rotor settings for this particular message. And I see that the rotor settings are that well-known setting, BBC.
Aha, good clue.
Good clue there. So we set that to BBC, and then we start keying in the received enciphered text. And we key in S, and the A lamp lights, and then we key in P, and the E gives A, and I gives N. So that spells Alan so far. Mm-hmm. And then we get a space, an X, and then L, T.
Here we are. Alan Turing was here. Very clever.
Yes.
And what's the significance of Alan Turing?
Alan Turing was a very important person in the story of Bletchley Park. A mathematician came here, and he applied his mathematical brain to the problem of breaking the Enigma cipher. And in doing that, he picked up an original idea of the Poles and developed the Turing bomb,
right.
B-O-M-B-E, that is. Mm-hmm. And this was a marvellous machine, a mechanical machine, which helped to find the key settings for the Enigma machine, and helped enormously in breaking the Enigma messages.
Well, in fact, we're going to hear more about Alan Turing a bit later on. Apart from him, then, what sort of people worked here?
Oh, an enormous wide range of people from all walks of life. Quite a lot of academics, of course, but also people just drafted in from the services. And there were about equal numbers of service people and civilians here, Army, Navy, Air Force and civilians. One Army gentleman who came here was struck the moment he came through the door by the fact that in Bletchley Park ideas were encouraged, and that was a difference to where he'd been in the Army. But the atmosphere here must have been quite unique. And a number of the people who worked here have said to me that in their view it was the 60s in the 40s.
Fascinating. Well, as Tony said, the Wrens, the Women's Royal Naval Service, were part of the Bletchley Park operation here. So let's now take a brief look at what the wartime was like for women. Now, in some ways, it was a liberating time, the 60s in the 40s, although, as this clip from a programme which focuses on gender issues shows, it was still an uphill task to get equality with men, even from the day a girl was born.
Here's a special birthday greeting to tell you of our joy. You're every bit as wanted, dear, as if you'd been a boy. We mustn't make distinctions now. Girls are just as good and true. You march alongside boys through life and fight the battles too. Your role is just as vital in love and peace and war. Though boys are officers in life's guards, and girls the catering corps.
Our cameraman called in at a Royal Naval School where the Wrens are receiving a 9-week course in cookery. In ideal hygienic conditions, they're taught clean and economic cooking under a chef with 25 years civilian experience.
When this 1941 Wren's recruitment film was made, women had a vital wartime role to play. But it was a supporting role, and it was defined by men.
The Wrens need recruits for cooking. Judging by the look of the food lying around, there's going to be a rush of applications. It looks positively luscious. It's a job worth doing. Join the Wrens and cook for the Navy.
Perhaps one of the reasons these ideas are hard to shift is that they've been with us so long.
Isn't it strange that probably for the first time in English history, women are fighting side by side with the men?
The first time? Aye, I can't quite see my mother driving a lorry in a tin hat.
Of course, you know, this is going to make a tremendous difference to the status of women after the war's over.
I'm sure it will, my dear.
Despite Anne's hopes for the future, greater wartime opportunities didn't necessarily mean liberation. Once again, it was a man's world that women entered, and they couldn't leave behind their association with domestic affairs.
Wives took their husbands' place. Sweethearts worked and waited, from armchair to auto truck, from babies to barrows, from crochet to crossing keeping, from dusters to driving. Throughout the whole of the company system, they came and carried on the good work.
This inspector checks hard-to-see rivets inside the huge wing.
Despite their newfound status, women still could not escape gender stereotypes.
Uh-oh. The eternal feminine.
It's hard to imagine today walking amongst these abandoned buildings, but by the end of the war, there were 12,000 people working here, all dedicated to one thing: deciphering, translating, and cracking the German codes. But just how important was the work here to the war effort? Well, someone I'm sure who knows is Robert Harris, who's written a novel about the work here at Bletchley Park called Enigma. You might know it. Morning, Robert.
Good morning.
So just how crucial was the work here to the outcome of the war?
Oh, absolutely crucial. Without the work done at Bletchley Park, it's quite possible that Britain would have had to have got out of the war. And even if that hadn't been the case, it's probable that what was done here shortened the war by 2 years.
Now, during your research for the book, you've talked to German military veterans. What did they know or suspect about what might have been happening somewhere in Britain?
From time to time they did suspect, especially the German Navy. Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat arm, believed that his codes were being broken and on 2 occasions launched inquiries into the security of Enigma. And in each case, the people who reported on the security of Enigma were the people who had put it into operation in the first place. So they had a vested interest in saying everything was fine. And they simply said that this is an unbreakable machine, which indeed on paper, mathematically, it does appear unbreakable. What the Germans never counted on was the fact that we had developed here a machine which could break a machine-generated code.
I'm sorry, you know we're not allowed to talk in here.
This is probably one of the most secret buildings in Britain, if not in the world. This was where Turing's first bomb came. It's the machine that broke the Enigma code. It was called Agnus, and eventually this hut had 5 of these bomb machines in it, huge, about the size of a sort of walk-in wardrobe. They made an enormous noise. The din in here was like a sort of knitting factory, and they were quite dangerous to operate. People used to get electric shocks off them.
Really?
Yes. And they would leak puddles of oil, and these were the original, I suppose in a sense, the forerunners of the computer.
Now, it's a pretty desolate place today in 1997, but what might it have been like at the time to work and live here?
Well, this was a huge base. I mean, from the entrance gate to the back fence over there was nearly half a mile. and there were some 12,000 people working here by the end of the war. So this was a massive operation. I mean, this was intelligence in the machine age.
12,000 of them. How on earth did they keep this place secret?
Well, it is one of the great mysteries of the war, and they kept it secret actually not just during the war, but through to 1974. I think a combination of things. Remember the sort of times that they were. You know, there was a sort of paranoia. Walls have ears. You know, keep mum and so on. A lot of people didn't even know what they were working on. I mean, out of that 12,000, only a few hundred would even have heard the word Enigma, for instance. And some people were told, quite a lot of the Wrens were told, that what they were doing was affecting the course of the war. They were told, for instance, that they had been instrumental in sinking the Bismarck. And I've talked to women who would sort of catch a train to London, and they'd be paranoid about who was coming up behind them in case they wanted to find out the secret. There's a famous story of a woman in 1970 who collapsed at a dinner table with a brain hemorrhage, and she last thought as she was taken away was, I must not talk about Enigma, I must not talk about Enigma under the anaesthetic. I mean, that's the level of the secrecy that was ingrained into people, that if they talked about it, the Germans might know their codes were being broken and the war would be lost.
Fantastic unity. Do you think we could possibly achieve that today in today's society, that sort of secrecy?
I think it'd be much more difficult because I think we've lost the knack of discretion, which was second nature to a lot of the people here. They had the best mathematicians, some of the best mathematicians in the country here, and by one of those accidents of fate, the crucial mathematician Alan Turing had made his name in the mid-1930s with a paper called On Computable Numbers, in which he posited a giant machine capable of solving mathematical problems. And this theoretical work he was able to put to work when he came here and build a machine. The first machine was called a bomb, which broke Enigma, and then later a machine called Colossus, which was used to tackle even more sophisticated codes, and which was a computer, effectively. Without Turing and without others of that stamp, you know, this place would not have worked.
And the extraordinary thing, I think, was that Turing was just 27 years old at the time.
Yes, he was, and he's not a particularly militaristic sort of person. He was obviously known, we all know, a homosexual. He was sort of quite shy, very eccentric, would cycle into work here, for instance, in the summer because he suffered from hay fever wearing a gas mask. You know, he was one of the great eccentrics, but, you know, he received very little recognition in his lifetime, but now we can see him as one of the towering figures of the century in mathematics, and a person who, around whom the war turned in some ways.
A man very much for the moment.
He was, yes, and even in a place that was full of brilliant minds, he was known as the Prof, and was seen as someone a cut above even the other mathematical geniuses here.
Well, if you're interested in hearing a bit more about Alan Turing, be sure to listen to tomorrow's radio broadcast, which is devoted to Turing and his work. It's part of the Maths Miscellany series, which starts a new season at 8 p.m. every Sunday night on BBC Radio 4 Longwave. So, the German coded messages were broken by the brilliance of Turing and the team here at Bletchley Park. Of course, nowadays, messages can be sent worldwide at the press of a computer button, and yet the encoding key method used by Enigma is still the basis for the way we protect electronic mail today. With the advent of the internet comes the need for more and more sophisticated encryption techniques to make sure that what's in our computers remains secure. Well, our next programme clip takes a look at the internet and the work of hackers. People who read your messages illegally and sometimes spread malicious viruses and worms.
The next morning, I couldn't log into my computer system. And that was how I first discovered that the worm had gotten on our machines.
A Cornell University graduate student whose father is a top government computer security expert is suspected of creating the virus that has clogged thousands of military and research computers across the nation. But school officials say they doubt there was any intent to cause damage. NBC's Robert Hager has more.
Cornell University said the virus was apparently spawned by the computer of one of its graduate students, 23-year-old Robert Morris, Jr.
The worm program was designed to spread to other computer systems. And so when it started running on one computer, the first thing it would attempt to do is find nearby machines that it would find it easy to get into. It would spread to those machines. Then it would try to find other targets, possibly somewhat farther afield. And it would then establish copies of itself on those machines. Unfortunately, the program might establish itself multiple times on the current machine, because machines far away might send copies of the worm program to it. The result is we'd have a computer system running dozens, perhaps scores of this worm program, tying up the computer system, tying up the file, tying up the network, to the point where the machine was simply overwhelmed. It had no more capacity, and in some cases the machine just stopped processing entirely. It crashed.
The worm virus of 1988 infected at least 1 in 10 of the computers on the internet and caused massive disruption worldwide. Could it happen again? Just how safe are computer networks now? What are the threats posed by malicious and damaging software, such as worms and viruses? And how do you stop computer hackers from vandalizing the network?
We now have in the tens of millions of machines and users around the world. We have absolutely no idea who all is on the network and what they're doing.
The Internet owes its birth to the Cold War. The US military experimented with a communications network that would operate no matter how many sites were destroyed during an attack. Messages could be routed along any existing path, not necessarily the most direct one. As it grew, this massively interconnected network became known as the Internet. The Internet's distributed structure meant that central control was impossible. Its anarchic community relied on self-regulation and trust. The worm Robert Morris released showed just how vulnerable computers on the net were when that trust broke down. Since 1988, the Internet has expanded rapidly. Commerce has dictated the growth of computer networking within companies and between them. As familiar high street institutions with sensitive data, such as banks and hospitals, join the Internet, security has become a priority. Increasingly, computer data controls our lives, but who controls the data? The challenge for system designers is to provide security mechanisms which prevent attack on their computers, while at the same time allowing authorized traffic to pass freely across the network. To achieve these conflicting goals, engineers borrow some ideas from the past.
There's a particularly good parallel between castles and computer systems. We have a drawbridge, we have a gate, and we have guards.
The physical defenses of a castle are a good model for understanding the software security of a computer. We'll examine the parallels in detail later. To begin, though, it's helpful to look beyond the castle walls, at the world outside our control.
An organisation is seldom within one building, and it wants to send messages between the various sites. If you take the analogy of a castle, it's a bit like having to connect your castles with roads and finding that the security of the castle isn't breached, but any messengers you send between the castles get ambushed on the way.
To achieve guaranteed delivery across the Internet, messages are broken down and sent out in small packets. Each packet is given a number and its own copy of the final address, so they can be sent independently via different routes. At the destination, they're assembled in the correct order to reform the original message. It's tempting to think of this message delivery as an electronic version of the postal network we're so familiar with, but there are some important differences. The post office has a long history. We have a pretty good idea of how it works, and we trust it. The same cannot be said about the internet.
If I post you a letter, I'm trusting the Royal Mail, but I know I'm not to a great extent trusting lots and lots of organisations. If I send a message out onto the internet, I'm trusting maybe hundreds of organisations because I don't know what route my message will take, and I'm therefore trusting a large number of strangers.
It's passed through a whole load of people that you have no knowledge about.
On the internet, the packets are effectively being written on the back of electronic postcards. And they're pretty well open for anybody who cares to look at them, to read them, to understand them, and perhaps even to forge them and introduce fake messages.
It is possible to protect the data as it crosses the network using encryption.
Encryption is a process of transforming information from its normal usable form into a scrambled form that is not usable by anybody who isn't in possession of particular secret keys that can be used to unscramble it.
Cryptography and encryption dates back thousands of years. And the word cryptography comes from the Greek, meaning secret writing.
It is the only way known, and in a sense maybe the only way imaginable, for people to control information that is out of their physical possession.
An example of early encryption is transposing letters to produce a secret version of a message. But such simple codes were easy to crack. So more complex codes were developed that required more effort to break. In World War II, the Germans transmitted their military communications in a code that was virtually impossible to crack. Messages were encrypted using an electromechanical device known as the Enigma machine. A crucial factor in the Allied victory was decoding the German Enigma messages. This immense task was achieved at Bletchley Park, itself one of the best-kept secrets of the war. Breaking down the Enigma code required a huge computational effort. It was only possible to decipher so many messages because fragments of the code necessary to decrypt or unscramble a message were captured from German military units. The Enigma story shows a fundamental weakness of all traditional encryption methods, namely that the code, the key, to reverse the encryption process must be sent out to someone who wants to read a message. Anyone, friend or foe, who has possession of a copy of the encryption key can unlock the coded message. Imagine that Alice wants to send a secret message across the internet to her friend Bob. Alice can encrypt the text to keep it secret, but so that Bob can read it, she must also send a copy of the encryption key to him. The link between Alice and Bob may not be secure. Someone may be eavesdropping on the line. Using a secret code key, Alice encrypts her message and sends it to Bob. Eve also captures the message. When Alice sends a copy of the encryption key to Bob, he can decode the message. But Eve, who also gets the key to unlock the message, can read it too.
So if you keep the key secure, the messages will be secure. If you lose the key, the messages will be lost. It transfers the problem from one of moving the messages around to one of moving the key around.
Today, this problem with handling code keys has been solved by a technique known as public key cryptography. The coding relies on difficult mathematics, but fortunately, the principle is easier to understand.
Public key cryptosystems are to some extent similar to the way you'd use a night safe at a bank, where the bank gives out a large number of keys which are in fact identical to lots of shopkeepers within a city. Those shopkeepers might want to deposit their takings, so they go to the safe, unlock the door and put their money in. What they don't want is for some rival company to come along with their key, open the safe and take the money out. But what actually happens is the money falls down a chute into a safe within the bank, and the bank has a different key which they then use to unlock the night safe and take the money out. The idea being that having access to the key that allows you to put things into a night safe does not allow you to take things out of a night safe.
In a public key system, we have two entirely different keys. And the trick to it is that it's very difficult to find one key from the other.
The pair of code keys have different but complementary functions. One of the keys can only encrypt data, like the shopkeeper's public keys for the night safe, which can only deposit money. The other key is the only one that can decrypt the message. It's like the bank's unique private key for withdrawing money from the night safe. Now suppose that Bob has a pair of such code keys. He gives away copies of the key that can only encrypt messages to everyone, so this is known as his public key. Bob doesn't even mind if a copy goes to Eve. Alice now encrypts her message to Bob using his public key, but only Bob's personal private key can decrypt this message. Since Bob never had to transmit his private key, no one else, including Eve, can read the message.
So that's entirely analogous to the very free ability we have in the mail system to take an envelope and write an address on it and seal a letter in it and send it off, with pretty good assurance that only the person we're sending it to is going to get it, be able to open it and read it. The other thing that we can do with public key systems is, curious enough, analogous to the other thing we do with letters, which is we sign them. You will be able to recognize from the fact that it was encrypted with my private key that only I could have sent it to you.
Public key encryption has been implemented in many different software packages. An example is PGP, Pretty Good Privacy. Such software makes secure communications available to everyone. The encrypted text is virtually impossible to crack, even working at it for years using the most powerful computers currently available. So, messages can pass along the internet with a degree of safety greater than that of the postal network. But encryption, no matter how strong, is not the solution to all security problems. It's still necessary to protect computers against threats that may hide inside a message, or against the strangers who may come knocking at the computer's door.
What's your password?
Albatross.
Okay.
The traditional method of determining friend or foe is the password challenge. Knowing the correct password grants entry to the system. It's a technique that's been universally adopted by software designers. But how secure is it? Who might be trying to guess your password?
The state of the internet today is that it provides very easy access to almost any computer hooked up to it anywhere on the planet. You could be working on a computer in California and be attacked by someone from Europe or Australia in another time zone. Maybe they're working while you're asleep.
Imagine I want to break into a computer over the internet. By some means, I've managed to steal a copy of its password file, for instance from some network database server. And if we look at the entries that are stored in this password file, we find users, for instance, like Paul Turner here, who works in the student union, if this is a university. His username is Turner, and here is his encrypted password string. Now, I cannot mechanically reverse this password into what the original text is. What I must do to try and break into this machine is fire a dictionary of words at this entry and at all the other entries in the password file to try and find a user who has chosen a weak password, one that is based upon a dictionary word. So what I'll do is launch a password cracking program which loads a dictionary of 1,000,000 words and tries other words based on the user's name, like Paul Turner, Paul T, Turner P, variations on that theme. It takes these words and encrypts them using the same algorithm that is used to generate the data in the password file. and compares the two. And when it finds a match, it prints out the text of the password that it used to generate this string. This gives us the information we need to break into the remote computer. For instance, here we found a user, Sindana L, who has chosen a password Sindana L with a capital C. With this piece of information, I can then break into the remote computer, and once I'm on that computer, I can do anything I like.
Aardvark, Aardwolf, Abba.
Abaft, Abalone. Abandon, Abase, Abash, Abate,
This method of cracking a password is called a dictionary attack. As processor power grows, it becomes a trivial task to test a huge number of words. Eventually, the hacker is likely to crack at least one password. But does that really matter?
Zion, Zionism.
The importance of password security is that once somebody is in, as you are inside this castle, you can do almost anything. You have access to the secret rooms, you are past most of the lines of defense. Once you are in, you can then start prodding around looking for weaknesses that will get you further into the inner sanctums where all the important information is kept. You can go around, create havoc and destroy things. There is a difference between computing and real life. A single person inside a castle cannot theoretically create very much havoc. But once you have a single entry point for somebody into a computer, due to sometimes bugs in the software, due to misconfigurations of the operating system software, there are many weaknesses that can be exploited to become the super user of the computer, a person with absolute rights and absolute privileges over all data, to destroy things, change things, modify things. And this is a situation that needs to be avoided.
Just a reminder that you're watching Open Saturday from Bletchley Park, and I'm actually sitting in front of a reconstruction of one of the very first computers that was used in the Second World War. Now, I'm totally confused as to what sort of security words I should be using.
Well, passwords should never be based on any sort of language that's natural or spoken in the world. You could take Edward Lear's Book of Nonsense Verse, translate it into Polish, reverse all the words backwards, and it still wouldn't be a very good idea to use that, because computers are quite capable of getting a hold of a Polish dictionary, and that could be used as a source to try and break your password. If you want reasonable security, you should try and use computer passwords which are as long as possible and have uppercase and lowercase letters, digits, punctuation characters, spaces. Throw everything in. It should look like complete gibberish.
But what I seem to understand is in the future, even that isn't going to be enough. If computers continue to expand in this way and get more and more powerful, what's the future for cryptology?
It's questionable if we continue to write programs the same way we do at the moment. It becomes a matter of brute forcing a password, trying every single possible combination. And as computers become more and more powerful, this becomes a more feasible task. So there is no doubt that I could be able to break your password just by trying every single possibility. Instead, we'd have to change the way we write programs so that we move away from simple, reused password systems into something more of a traditional, at the castle gate, challenge and response with different words being used in each case.
Very interesting. Alec Muffet, thank you very much. Well, this morning's programme from the Open University has, broadly speaking, had a theme of code breaking, and we've just been delving into the worlds of computing and computer hackers. However, codes aren't just found in the world of espionage. Another famous code has been about for as long as life itself.
We could test for myotonic dystrophy. Those 3 conditions can be tested without a family history.
How'd you get on? What did Noam say?
Oh, fine. The job just required clearance for the synthesis plant, but it turns out I'm not susceptible to any of their chemicals, so I can work anywhere at the factory.
What's this? You've had the whole lot done, haven't you?
Oh, but this could save us money in the long run. Look, nothing's shown up on any of the tests I've ever had. And Mum and Dad haven't had a day's illness in their lives, not even a dicky heart.
I am sick of the whole business. Genes, genies, genomes...
Oh, that's probably Klaus.
Klaus Vermes. Insurance.
So, you've been gnomed. The old cell snoopers have been rummaging through your chromosomes.
Drink?
Need you ask? You know me. I could live off the stuff. Jeannie's told me this liver could detox anything. Mind if I smoke?
Yes.
Oh, susceptible?
No, just makes the place smell. Anyway, Michelle and Laura might be.
I'll get them checked, mate. Costs next to nothing, and then at least you'll know.
Genome's a dirty word to Michelle. Anyway, shall we get on with it?
So, come on then. Let's have a look. Okay, Jose. Let's see what the men in white coats made of you.
What are you looking for these days? I mean, there seems to be more and more added each year.
Only the main baddies. Oh yeah, we have a very strict code on that one. Only those approved by the committee. Heart, mind, lungs, stomach. Yeah, pretty much everything. But the more we have, the more we can tailor the policy to your needs. And of course, all these juicy facts about you, John, are for my eyes only.
Yeah, I bet.
Good, good. Well,
there's information available about all the programs in Open Saturday and about all Open University courses. If you'd like a free information pack, please phone on 01604 673 817 or write to us at the Open University, PO Box 625, Milton Keynes MK1 1TY. There's an Open Saturday email address and a website, and we're also on CFAX, page 617.
So for better or worse, you might want to store your genetic makeup on a CD. But how carefully would you have to protect the data to keep it error-free? Surely a CD-ROM like this would crash because it's so badly scratched. Well, let's find out in this next clip about the maths of error correction.
Each CD has a spiral track, just like a gramophone record. But that's where the similarity ends. To start with, the track is scanned outwards from the centre, rather than inwards. It's also scanned at a constant speed, just over a metre a second, so that the disc slows down as it plays, from 8 revolutions per second to less than 4. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the sound is recorded on the disc in a digital format. Any sound, whether music or speech, can be represented as a waveform like this, an analog signal. With stereo, there are 2 such waveforms for the left and right channels. To convert each analog signal into digital form, it's sampled at regular intervals, and the value is measured. The value is represented as a binary number, a string of 16 bits. The bits are processed 8 at a time. Each group is called an information symbol, and the symbols are encoded before they're recorded onto the compact disc. This combination of laser scanning and digital recording was developed in the Netherlands by Philips in the early 1980s. Here in the Philips Research Labs, this large-scale model of a compact disc is meant just as a showpiece, but it will serve to demonstrate some of the key features of the system. This light is reflected off the undersurface of the disc as it rotates. And as you can see here, sometimes it's bright, and sometimes it's dark. But it is in fact in the timing of the transition from light to dark and from dark back to light that we find the coded information. Along the spiral track, there's a succession of pits, depressions in the surface of the disc. By contrast, the parts of the track level with the surface are called lands. The pits are of different lengths, but they're all of the same depth, just less than a quarter of a wavelength of the laser light. So the light reflected back from the bottom of a pit travels about half a wavelength further, and so it's nearly 180 degrees out of phase with the light from the surface. Destructive interference thus makes the pits look darker than the lands. Each land to pit or pit to land transition corresponds to a 1 bit, with 0 bits in between at regular intervals. To make these recordings, the first stage involves a master disc. This is created using a high-power argon laser. The beam is carefully focused onto the blank disc and modulated with the digital signal. Once the master disc is completed, the process of creating submasters and final production discs is then purely mechanical. There's a lot of technology involved in reading a disc too. The laser spot on the surface of the disc has a diameter of about 1 micron. This has to follow the spiral track accurately, even if the turntable is slightly off-center. Ston Bocken, from the Phillips Research Labs, shows us how this could be done.
To show that this is possible, look at this experiment. This uses a servo system with 3 spots, 1 central spot that reads the information and 2 satellite spots on either side of the track. If you move the disc such that the central spot goes off track due to an eccentricity, for instance, one of the satellite spots sees less of the track while the other one sees more of the track. This imbalance in reflected light then causes the servo system to correct the position of the central spot that reads the information. Now you can clearly see that the central spot moves with respect to the position of the track.
In this demonstration, the servo system controls the mirror which deflects the spot from side to side, so that it can follow horizontal variations in the track position. But there's also vertical motion to worry about, up to 1 millimeter. This also needs to be followed.
With the help of this experiment, we can show to you how the optimal distance between the lens and the disc is maintained. It's the focus servo. The light is first focused onto the disc, and on its return path it goes through the prism and then is focused onto 2 small spots on these detectors. By the positions of those 2 spots, we can detect the optimal distance between the lens and the disc in the following manner. If the distance between the lens and the disc changes, those 2 spots on the diodes move inward or outward depending on the distance between the lens and the disc. Then the servo system responds by moving the lens back to the optimal position with respect to the disc. As you can see, the lens is mounted onto a coil which moves in a permanent magnet, just like a loudspeaker system. By making use of the error signals, as have been shown before in the experiment, we can optimally control the distance of the lens with respect to the disc.
So sophisticated control systems make sure the laser spot follows the track as closely as possible. But so far, there's nothing to suggest any improvement in the quality of the recorded signal. And this turns out to be essential for the success of the system.
The CD system would be infeasible without an efficient error correction system, since cheap mass replication of gigabits of information is impossible without creating any error. Already a new freshly pressed disk may contain hundreds of thousands of errors, and due to handling, this number of errors may increase even more. For instance, a disk full of fingerprints might sound like this if you had no error correction at all.
When Philips sought advice about the error correction built into the design of the compact disc, they found it very close to their headquarters in Eindhoven. Working here at the university is a world expert on coding theory, Professor Jack van Linde.
Let me tell you about the origin of
coding theory back in the late 40s at Bell Laboratories in the United States. Richard Hamming became very irritated by the fact that his computer was able to detect if an error occurred and then switched off. And every morning when he came to the laboratories, he found that the computer had switched off. And he said, if the computer can detect an error, it should be able to correct an error. And thus he discovered what is known as the Hamming code.
So, with digital representation of sound, error correction can be used to improve quality. In the CD recording process, the signal is first converted into digital form. Then it's passed through an error correction encoder, and finally it's sent to a special modulation encoder which balances the number of ones and zeros recorded on the disc. The reverse happens when the disc is played back. The signal passes first through a modulation decoder, then it goes to an error correction decoder, and finally it's converted back to analog form to be sent to the amplifiers and loudspeakers.
This is Open Saturday. Now, it's only in the last 30 or 40 years that we've been exposed to new audio-visual teaching media. Today, many children are going to be more computer literate and more familiar with the technology than adults. Well, here's part of a programme which looks at the effect on children of computing and computer games in particular.
It is Tim and Sally and a car.
Since the 1960s, there have been dramatic changes in the electronic media that children have learned to use inside and outside school. As these technologies have become more complex, they have come to play an ever-increasing part in children's lives, raising questions about their impact on social and intellectual development. Are they encouraging a generation of social isolates? Do they have the potential to change the way children think? And what contribution is psychology making to our understanding of the effects of these new media?
I like it better than watching cartoons because of, well, you can control the characters and it's just like you making your own cartoon up with the characters.
I think it makes you feel good that you're doing well on something. And also on Echo the Dolphin, it's not really getting the scores, it's rescuing dolphins and rescuing your friends. And, you know, it makes you feel happy.
It's got a girl in it as well called Channel A, and that's why most girls play her especially. And also in this game they've made her one of the best players. They made her faster than all of the others. They've made her have special moves which are better.
Children's engagement in new technology poses a challenge to adults. The temptation is either to dismiss it as trivial or to worry about its compulsive appeal.
If they were doing something simple, repetitive all the time, then they get very quickly bored. It's because it offers them a whole range of possibilities that they enjoy what they think is the fantasy of it, because it's all about power and control and being in control. Which, of course, if you're a child, is the one thing you long to be.
I find it quite interesting that when children become very devoted to activities such as chess or reading or whatever, parents and teachers tend to praise them. But somehow there is a suspicion about new technology, which has gone on from generation to generation. The telephone was supposed to make you go deaf. Travelling at more than 20 miles an hour in a train was supposed to make the human body disintegrate.
I was born in a house with a television always on.
I think there's moral panic about anything that people don't understand well. The same moral panic, the same things were actually said about television in the 1950s, and many, many research projects were initiated then to look at exactly the same things. Is it going to create a nation of recluses who don't interact, who don't play with each other, who don't talk to each other?
Children are making alternative worlds all the time. That's what they do when they tell stories. In some ways, what I see in the new technology are new folk tales, which are shared because they do share the same video games, the same video tracks. What people worry about is in case they lose themselves in a world and stop having contact with what they call reality. I think that's unlikely for the normal child.
Contrary to public myths, I actually found that children who were the more introverted type, who actually went into new technology, playing computer games or programming, whatever, actually increased their social circles. They now had street credibility. People came to them for advice. How do I get to the next level on this game or whatever? Many children are still very suspicious of new technology, so they acted as gurus to these children.
Concerns about the social effects of the new technologies go hand in hand with concerns about their effects on children's intellectual development. For instance, the concern about the time taken up that could be spent on reading. The speed of technological change also means that each new generation of children is faced with dramatically different experiences to those of their parents and teachers. Present-day concerns, too, have tended to highlight the effects of the new media on the individual. But research hasn't shown either the threatened ill effects or the promised benefits to be as universal as some have claimed. In fact, it's the social activity that the new technology supports that's proving to be one of its most significant legacies.
Except for the memory, you've got a lot of We've come here to look at children and their learning with computer games, because computer games have been one of the most contentious areas. People have been most critical of children with computer games, and we've looked and we've surprised ourselves by what we've found. For example, we've found good collaborative dialogue, we've found collaborative endeavour, we've found delight, we've found children's face lighting up by the pleasure that they've gained from solving a problem. And that problem solving, I think, is at the heart of the most exciting of what we think we're seeing with children using computer games. They've got a shared problem and a shared task and a shared dialogue.
Children who are working around computers are often being asked to work with abstract ideas, but they're being given a technology that makes those abstract ideas in some sense accessible and tangible. And it's also giving them a technology that allows them to be fairly actively engaged with that material so that they can interact with it and manipulate it and experiment with it. Now, when you've got that kind of combination, you've created for the pupils a setting in which they have a lot of shared knowledge.
It's less clear what other long-term effects of the new technology are likely to be. Children quickly adapt to the new possibilities created by the technology. For adults, it's often harder to come to terms with these changes.
Most of us of our generation are reasonably good at thinking in two dimensions spatially, but add a third dimension and make it move. And most of us, our thinking collapses. Now, new technology provides the means to produce this dynamic imagery through time. What, I wonder, is going to be the effect on children's thinking when they've had a couple of generations, as it were, of exposure to these sorts of dynamic representations. But how will that enter into their metaphors of thinking, into the analogies that they draw from thinking? It seems to me there is a possibility that there could be some reasonably exciting effects on children's intellectual competences.
You're watching Open Saturday, and with me now is Diana Lorillard, who's an educational psychologist from the Open University. Diana, we've just been watching kids playing computer games. A lot of those are on CD-ROM. Now, is this an effective way to teach adults?
Oh, I think it's fine for adults too, yes. If you think about what those kids are doing, they're playing with a system. They're learning about the behavior of a system. Now, that's ideal for adults learning about abstract concepts just as children are learning about the kinds of concepts in those particular systems. It's the way we very easily learn as human beings. As children, we learn about the physical world through playing with it. Well, when you're doing a degree course and you're learning about rather abstract concepts like energy, say, it's quite difficult to play with those concepts. Well, a computer model, a program, is simply a way of processing a lot of data according to a lot of rules, according to the kind of input you're putting into it. Now, if you take one of the programs we're using on our technology course, for example, it simulates a home energy system. Now, what the student can do is play around with changing the air temperature, changing the kind of insulation material you've got, and the computer will process that according to the rules of that model and tell you what's happening to the internal temperature of the house, let's say. Now, that enables the student to play with that system, get a feel for how it's operating, how it's behaving, just as a child plays with building blocks or whatever.
Now, how important is it that the programme should be interactive, like this rather wonderful one here? This is the Enigma programme, and if you're very clever, you can crack codes with it.
This interception just came in from the radio room. We need you to decrypt it as soon as possible.
It's very important. That is the key. What you need is to be able to have some sort of goal you're aiming for, and you're trying to do something, making decisions about the system. You're getting feedback from the system, which tells you how close you are to your goal, and on the basis of that, you change it.
I don't think it'll work like that.
Now, that's precisely what a computer game is. For an adult, it will be just the same kind of thing in trying to get to grips with what a system is and how it behaves.
Now, I find it rather surprising that, in fact, CD-ROM sales aren't going nearly as well as people thought they would. So is there some sort of backlash going on?
I think you just have to look at the nature of those CDs. Very often you'll find that essentially what they are is a kind of encyclopedia on disc, and you can click your way through a lot of information. But that's not giving anything very interesting to do. If it were more game-like, and if what you had to do was achieve some goal and play around, manipulate a system, I'm sure you'd find they were very popular.
As these things progress, the educational software gets better. Will it mean the end of the thick textbook for good?
I'm afraid not, no, because you still need that articulation of the theory. You still need to be able to understand human thinking through that sort of mode of communication just as much as you ever did. But the advantage of an interactive system like this is it gives you the ability to play with that and manipulate it and see that alongside the development of the theory.
So the books will still be there too?
They'll always be there.
Diana, thank you very much indeed. Well, with huge commercial profits at stake, games manufacturers are a key driving force behind advances in computing. Nowadays, the industry puts a great deal of thought into the design of computer systems to make them more user-friendly. And computing has moved on from asking the user to type command lines into the operating system lying deep within the computer. Here's part of an Open University programme about what's called the HCI, the Human Computer Interface.
This is the operating system of a large high-rise hotel. Like a computer operating system, it's filled with the wires, the pipes, the equipment necessary to make the hotel work and to make the hotel occupants comfortable. In the old days of the command line interface, users were expected to walk the dark labyrinths of a world like this, never sure of where they were going, or whether they would ever get back. But today, software designers create for their users a clean, comfortable, illusory world. Upstairs. A world like this, a visually apparent, concrete reality through which users can move at will, pointing and clicking their way through their desktop environments, even as the guests at the Hyatt Regency Hotel can wander among the many services available to them. The architect of the hotel applied certain principles of design, rules that, in many cases, are equally applicable to software. One must never drop the user into the basement. Reset. To avoid that happening, software designers have to be in on a project on the ground floor. It does no good to bring in an architect to pick out the color of the curtains when the building has already been constructed with no windows. The hotel environment is filled with objects familiar to us all. The house phone, the brochure rack, the bell. Software designers employ a methodology, tools of the trade, that result in objects and environments that are similarly consistent with user expectations. One hopes.
To make users feel comfortable, successful software surrounds them with pictures or icons of familiar objects. Because such environments are meant to resemble the everyday world, designers say they're using a metaphor.
The big win in the personal computing business was to move from a command line, which is not a metaphor, to the best of my knowledge, to something more visually based, such as a desktop metaphor. It provides an immediate point of entry and contact with the user.
Guests arriving at a new hotel don't need to read a manual or user's guide to work out how to check in or use the many services the hotel provides. They have an understanding or mental model of how the hotel works based on their previous experience. Good software uses metaphors which allow people to draw on their mental models of how the world works. All screen objects should fit the metaphor and act in sympathy with the user's expectations.
What a metaphor does is it allows us to help users create a mental model for this new system. So we typically try to take an anchor that users are familiar with and make a link to this new system.
They know what a rubbish bin is or a trash can, so they immediately know that would be to throw things away.
So when you create a user interface that it corresponds to a person's mental model, their framework of how they think something is going to work, then that's a good interface, because then they will understand and be able to anticipate how to do something.
Part of making the users comfortable is to let them move and manipulate screen objects in a similar way to the real objects they represent.
In the old days, every command entered into the computer went through the keyboard. I wouldn't want to have to manipulate this hedge trimmer by pressing keys. Instead, modern interfaces make use of direct manipulation, allowing users to interact intimately with their work. A mouse is a vast improvement over the keyboard, but sometimes we want to attack our work with both hands.
It's really quite simple. We slide the tool around with this trackball here, and we've also tried using a second mouse, and that works. You don't need terribly fine control over here because you're just positioning this tool, and then you have the mouse in your dominant hand just as you always would. What I want to do is bring the tool, the menus as it were, to my work, and then I'll just click right through them to be able to change the colors of things. We can make the grass nice and green, and we'll turn the path black. And you see I can run the trackball with just a very small amount of motion over here. Now you can run this with one hand if you want to. I could just pick this up and drag it over with the mouse and then click through. But we've discovered that if you do run it on two hands, then you naturally bring the two pointers together like this and overlap your motions, which is naturally more efficient. We use two hands in everyday life all the time, like a painter's palette, and that people don't worry about whether painters can actually manipulate the palette with one hand and the brush with the other.
The best designer in the world is actually the user. And if you listen to them really hard, they tell you all of the answers.
Would you fly on a plane that had no test flights? Of course not. You shouldn't be buying a product that has not been usability tested.
User testing is the companion of software design. Only through a repetitive cycle of testing and design can the development team ensure that when the product is eventually released, that users will not come across the occasional exhaust pipe
sticking up through the sidewalk.
Recognizing that you're always going to get it wrong, you try and get something built as quickly as possible so you can start finding out where you went wrong as soon as possible.
So the best thing to do is always to get the person to give you that feedback very, very early on, so you don't get overly committed to the particular type of visual tool that you've built or the programming tool that you've built. The first thing we need to do is actually go and meet the user that we're going to try and design an interface for, in this case for a doctor. And then we went on a field trip with him to actually look at what he does when he works with patients. We did some quick prototypes of what we thought might be a useful tool to enhance his particular, in this case, bronchoscopy exercise, so that he can share with another doctor the kinds of observations and problems he sees inside a patient's lungs. When we showed it to this doctor, he was overwhelmed and really excited. One of the things he particularly liked was it was a flat little screen that he could write on and also show the patient. So it didn't disturb the transactions and the eye contact with the patient, but rather he could write on it very quickly and also use that for sending to other doctors. The important thing to remember here is iterate many, many times and also get early, very early user feedback. It can be at the drawing stage, it doesn't have to be at the programming stage.
A project looking into future computing we did at Sun called Starfire was to figure out what we were going to do with computers when we had 3 and 4 gigahertz microprocessors and memory to burn and these wonderful network connections throughout the world.
Answer.
Good morning, Julie. We're trying to reach you.
Oh, Adrian, we've got trouble.
So we looked at person-to-person communication, not over the telephone, not over some little 100 by 100 pixel slow scan display, but when the people are as big as the people are in real life. People appearing remotely at meetings, not on little monitors up in the corner, but actually appearing to sit around the table. How is that going to change life?
And anyway, the production problem is solved. I pasted in the solution.
Although it's impossible to predict what new interfaces will look like, we can be fairly sure that to be successful, they must exploit the natural capabilities of their users.
Good.
Finding appropriate metaphors, allowing people to directly manipulate their work, and visualization of information will be increasingly important. The best new designs will be built on these principles by designers who listen and respond to the users.
This is wonderful, Adrian.
You're watching Open Saturday from the Open University. Now, for the remainder of the morning, we're going to look at some of the recent applications of computing software. In that last programme, we showed you an example of a system designed to help doctors with medical diagnoses. Well, here's a short clip which introduces the medical possibilities of another development, visual programming.
The most important issue about the future of computers is the degree to which people can program them themselves. Now, here's the reason why. In the future, computers will be much more than occasional devices that you use to write a letter or run a company's billing department or something. They will become the generic machines that store and move the artifacts of human culture around between people, and they'll also be the machines that are used to create that culture.
So here we are in the operating room.
When I say culture, I'm using it very broadly. I'm talking about everything from the way you talk to the laundry about doing shirts, to the transmission of classic works of literature, to the creation of new music, to the way that doctors will learn about and store for future generations information about gallbladders.
So let's get going. Wake up, nurse. So let's get started. Can I have the scalpel, please?
Scalpel. There you go.
Make our incision.
Now, if you believe that computers are a neutral medium, you're wrong. In fact, anytime a computer stores information or is used to create information, it colors that information. So if people are using computer programs provided by an elite group of programmers for the transmission of human culture, those programmers will have an undue influence on the nature of that culture.
Okay, I'm going to retract the liver so we can see the gallbladder. and it locks into place. And there you can see the gallbladder. And I'm going to get the forceps, please.
Forceps? How is the ordinary individual going to be creative in VR and use virtual reality to be creative without being a programmer, without knowing the intimacy of a computer? We work on visual programming, which is rather than text, which has a syntax base that you have to know the syntax before you can do anything. We do this visual programming. It's little boxes and lines, and you basically you can play around with things, and you can know a little bit and change things around and drag lines around. And as you know a little bit, you do a little bit, you know a little bit more, you do a little bit more, and as you keep doing that, you progress up this steady slope of knowledge until eventually, if you keep up with it, you're competent at telling a computer what to do. But you didn't have to go through this process of deciding, okay, I'm going to become a programmer. Those are the kind of things that we're trying to, that's the kind of stuff that we're working on.
Real close. Grabbed the cystic duct. In 10 years or 20 years, most of the applications we could point our finger at and identify as being virtual reality will have disappeared, not because we're no longer using them, but because they will have become so integrated into our lives and into other aspects of our work that they'll no longer be separate. The virtual reality will no longer be a separate technology at all, but just a way of looking at data or a way of communicating. Thank you. And the gallbladder has been removed.
Next, another software development designed to simplify computing for the user. It's one that gives qualities to the items within a computer model. It's called object-oriented programming. Here's an example from the construction industry, which also shows some of the possibilities presented by the internet.
It is quite common for changes to be made to the components of a building during the design phase. And these changes can have enormous impacts depending on who you are and how you're looking at that component. So if you take the case of a staircase, the staircase to an architect might be the colour of the finish, the design of the nosings and so forth. To the engineer, it could be part of the structural frame of the building. It will have a particular function to perform structurally. To the cost consultant or the quantity surveyor, it is a cost element in the building. So if you change any one element, it has an impact on all of these professional players. And at the moment, the process of accessing that information is frankly Dickensian. We wait for a letter to come through the post. Or sometimes it might come through on the email. But even if it comes through on the email, you've got to take that bit of information and translate it into the design process that you're engaged upon. So if you've got the whole thing happening organically in a central model, if anyone makes a change, everyone else is advised automatically as to what that change is. The whole design is updated simultaneously.
All these attributes and behaviours can now be represented in the model. The model staircase knows far more than simply what it looks like. It has information about its rises or steps. How many, their width and depth. A change to the number of rises causes another object in the model, one which carries information about the building regulations, to intervene. It advises that this change is illegal. These core models might be populated by thousands of objects, all communicating and collaborating with each other and advising the design team of the consequences of changes.
Yes. I think it's maybe a bit too blue. I think we should look at it with a more silvery colour.
Unlike traditional models, these computer models have components which can store vast amounts of information about their attributes and behaviour under different circumstances.
Let's explore the pod being a little larger, increase the bulk on the part, because that'll tell us at what point it's going to be too much.
Change that to 7 meters and apply that to the object. You can see how it's lengthened across to the side here. If we just render this in a very flat shaded colour now. Okay, we can see the problem that we now have having extended the service pod, in that the handrail is just appearing blurred as it intersects across with the service pod. The problem with the handrail at the moment is that it's not talking to the pod, or the pod rather isn't sending information to the handrail.
Right.
It hasn't told the handrail that the pod's got larger.
Right.
So the handrail's still in the same position.
So we'll need to link the two.
If we link the two elements, then they will effectively speak to each other.
Right.
And the behaviour of the pod will be reflected in the handrail.
Good.
As the pod gets larger, the handrail will get smaller, so they
Right.
still meet each other
Okay.
neatly.
Right. The classic problem with the consultants not working to a common idea is that there are physical clashes in the construction. One of the things we can do with the live three-dimensional model is take a piece of it and fit it into the model three-dimensionally. You can virtually pre-construct the building in the model. You can test with the construction contractor whether a beam can be put in through a particular hole and hoisted up inside and placed on its mounts. The beam occupies the same place that the services engineer thought he could run two pipes. If you discover that problem on the site, and that's too late. It costs you money on the site because it delays you in the construction process. You have to redo it on the site. You have to be paying twice for the job, and therefore it has a ripple effect on the whole construction program.
Building these systems from scratch would be a lot of work, but libraries of core components already exist, and the internet might help. Once it was restricted to delivering just text and still pictures. Now it can deliver virtual models to the architect's desk.
We're increasingly trading in an international market, and so for a complex building today, materials, products and systems will be supplied throughout the world. Each of these suppliers and manufacturers keeps a fairly comprehensive database of properties and so forth of his products, so that he could compare one product from, say, Taiwan with another one from the United States and so forth.
One of the properties of a huge manufacturing base on the web is that I could snatch things off it. I could pull down off the web a piece of live 3D model or live model and interact with it, fit it into my building, explore its interaction with the other pieces of my building, and say, well, this doesn't really quite do the job I want it. But the key point is that we'll be able to explore pieces. I could fly them in, pull them into my model, clip them into place, walk around my model, take the client through it, take my engineer through it, bearing in mind I might have cost data, I might have delivery times, I might have the weight, and I can explore it all and say, well, I'm not really convinced. Give it up, try again.
So these models can be used in the design phase and now in the construction phase. But do they throw all the information in them away once the building is complete?
Well, that is precisely what you don't do, of course. I mean, if we think about it, we, in the process of designing and constructing this building, have developed a very powerful understanding of it. We can visualize it, but we have a whole series of parameters now in this model that describe its attributes, its components, and so forth. A very, very powerful tool. It makes common sense that when we hand the building over to the client, we hand over to the client also a maintenance manual, in effect, a computer-based maintenance manual that would act as a powerful management tool for his management of the building downstream.
The running cost of the building is a very significant factor which can be dealt with in the live model. One can use the live model to instance different thermal scenarios for the building with certain sort of cladding, a different sort of cladding, a more insulative or less insulative cladding, more glazing, less glazing and so on. So the long-term running cost of the building and life health of the building can be actually addressed in the modelling. The user of the building for the next 10 years has the model, he understands what the design team's intent was, he understands the ratings on the system because he can click on his building model in his computer and he can see, well, the rating of that duct is so-and-so, and the light fitting in corridor 9 above there is a 15-watt, 240-volt of this type. Then it makes his job of managing a building during its life far simpler. Can you imagine the number of light fittings that are required to run Heathrow Airport and who has got them in their memory. Can you imagine what the lighting fitting store at Heathrow looks like? It must be incredible. A model which actually can instance all the light fitting information will change the world of maintenance people.
Taylor Woodrow are now looking into ways computer technology might help not just manage, but also control buildings once they're complete. They've wired up a mock house. Every major component of the house contains a microchip, so they're now controllable over a local area network.
There is a fire in the building. Please evacuate immediately. There is a fire in the building. Please evacuate. There is a fire in the building. Please evacuate immediately. There is a fire in the building.
Hello, Control.
Evacuate immediately.
The system's showing we've got an incident in Zone 6.
There is a fire in the building. Please evacuate immediately. Please evacuate immediately.
It is perfectly possible for a model of this type that if a fire occurs at a particular point in the building, that it could control immediately the opening up of all the fire exits. It could activate directions to aid the passage of people out of the buildings. It could operate a series of cameras to identify the source of the fire. It could even control the local sprinkler system to ensure that we are only spraying water at the point of the fire and not dousing the whole building in water and causing substantial damage to the fabric. These sorts of processes can again be handled very much by a model of this type.
Even the last moments of a building's life could be overseen by one of these models.
Traditionally, we've just knocked buildings down. There is a great deal of concern that within the fabric of the building there is a lot of material that can be recycled, can be reused and so forth. We can select materials in the first place that take this into account, and the model can aid us in that process. But it can also have within it advice, specific advice, on the various specific demolition procedures that need to be adopted. If we look at some of the more difficult structures that have been used, for example, for containment of nuclear facilities and so forth, there are some very, very strict requirements that have to be adopted in the decommissioning of these. Now, the precise procedures for safe removal, demolition and, where appropriate, recycling can all be handled in the model. I don't think it's a question of whether object-oriented modelling should excite us at all. I think it is becoming an increasing necessity. This is not a nice add-on. It is essential if we are, as an industry, to deliver to our clients what they expect of us. Nothing to do with computing and IT in a way. We are driven by the desires of our clients. Let's have better buildings. Let's have buildings delivered on time, and let's have buildings that cost us a lot less than they do today. This technology, I believe, has a pivotal role to play in meeting those business objectives.
You can call the Open Saturday hotline on 01604 673 817 or write to us at the Open University, PO Box 625, Milton Keynes, MK1 1TY. There's an Open Saturday email address and a website, and we're also on CFAX, page 617.
Whether or not you're impressed by computers, there is one fairly astonishing rule of computing. It's called Moore's Law, and it shows that computers have doubled their capabilities every 18 months for the last 20 years. Now, if that's true for the next 20, computers will then be 10,000 times more powerful than today. And what will they be capable of then? Well, there are some who say that computers are already smarter than many of us realise, especially when it comes to being creative. Well, judge for yourself in our final offering today, which explores what might be called artistic software.
Aaron is probably the world's only robot artist. It was made by Harold Cohen, the leading British abstract painter. Cohen's been working on Aaron since the late 60s. The program which plans or devises the pictures contains as much code or text as a medium-sized novel. But is Aaron simply regurgitating Cohen's own painting from its memory?
It's a genuinely generative package in the sense that the drawing didn't exist 5 minutes ago. Every drawing it does is a unique image that has never been seen before. If you see it making two figures instead of one figure, that's because it decided to do that. If it makes one person facing out of the painting, that's because it decided to do that. All of those decisions, everything you see on the canvas, is the result of whatever it was that the program did.
Aaron is probably unique in generating original paintings, but computers are in widespread use throughout the arts today. And there are real contributions that artists can make to the field of computing and software development.
What's very important about what we do here is that we're oriented towards live performance. There are modes of thinking that are very special to different disciplines. And I would say that not every mode of cognition is easy to capture in a computer language. I think we have to look to the arts and see how these modes of cognition can influence the design of machines that will, in some sense, respond to human need and human expression. It seems natural to me that there would be a payoff in doing this.
But what could artists gain from working with computers? Do computers constrain rather than enhance performances? Can computers ever operate fast enough to keep up with the intricacies of a live event? And doesn't the need to program restrict the way an artist can think about their work? But there have been many changes in the field of computing. Changes in the speed of machines, their programming languages, their ease of use, and their responsiveness.
This really marks the end of the first phase. The program's been manipulating closed forms, adding some open forms, crisscrosses, comb-like shapes, parallel lines and things like that.
One aspect of software development that has changed for everyone, artist or otherwise, is the speed at which computer programs can be written and tested. In the early days, Aaron's program only defined rules about how to generate simple shapes. The system could produce abstract pictures, all composed of just lines and squiggles. But in the 60s, writing even the simplest of Aaron's line drawing programs was a laborious process.
You had to type each single statement in a program on an IBM card, making sure that it was syntactically correct. Had to be extremely careful to make sure that you didn't get the cards mixed up, because if you did, obviously all hell would break loose if you tried to run the thing. And then literally you took all this bunch of cards and you put them all in a tray, and you handed them over the counter to the operator, who would say, come back tomorrow. That's how you got stuff into a computer, simply to debug, you know, a 25-line program. It might very easily take you 3 days. So it's a very long and tedious business.
And Cohen wasn't alone in finding programming a frustrating and slow process during the 60s.
Well, it was just a big waiting game. I remember very much